30 years ago, I worked at Channel 11. I mean, what have you done in the last 30 years? I can't believe it was totally a lifetime ago. But I want you to think for a minute about the decisions that we make in our life and the things that we end up doing as I backtrack on just a couple of the items that you would have seen in his bio. And for instance, he headed up the National Hurricane Center. And so that is monumental. This man is probably the most recognized person in the field in the United States, but also globally. We were lucky enough to have him. So for 13 years, he did that, and then he retired and came to KHOU in 1987. He and Velma came. By the way, 3 children, 10 grandchildren, 22 great grandchildren. Velma, look what you started. Yeah. So you can see that he has had a big life in a lot of ways. And I love the fact that when he was in high school, he was into sports, basketball. And he also liked science. And the science teacher convinced him, like, hey, look, you could be a coach and a science teacher. And he saw a great future there. And so he was off to that. Then he went into the Air Force. And the Air Force had a program, and the program related to meteorology. And he ended up getting his degrees, his Ph.D., and going on to where they had the National Weather Service in the first time a forecasting center for hurricanes. And of course, he rose through the ranks and got to the head of that operation. And then all these years later, we have been graced by him in Houston. I mean, he could dish up a forecast. And today, I'm going to just tell you that we're going to bring down a micro downburst and just level the field on your thinking about what's going on. Because when I saw him at our 70-year reunion a couple of months ago, we huddled. Like, what are we talking about here? Well, the truth is, it's time for the truth. And I think we all know that. I'm going to tell you that about 10 years ago, I happened to be in Ecuador on an assignment, and we jumped over to the Galapagos Islands. And when we were there, and I got there, somebody got off a plane same time I did. They were so excited because they were going to the same hotel, and they were going to be working with National Geographic. And they were working on global warming. And the enthusiasm, the thrill, the conviction was incredible. Well, over the course of the next several days, I got to tell you that I saw their vessel out there in the water. Oh my gosh, what a heady experience that must have been for that young lady. So you have to understand that there is such a posture that goes with that story that you can understand where that draw is all coming from. Well, tonight we're going to hear, not from Neil Young, although I will say you're going to hear about Forrest Frank. You're going to hear about that story. And we've had some big names. We've had Charlton Heston. But when it comes to the here and the now and what's important, I think that you're going to love that we were able to get. And how did we do that? Well, Vanita once told me that he once ended one of his talks by saying, if you want to know the truth about what's going on in meteorology, you have to hire one or bring one in that's retired. And so tonight, that's exactly what we have done. I'm thrilled that he's going to be able to share things all along the spectrum of what we see out here in the world and what we're really looking at. And if you have some questions, then he's delighted that he's going to be here to answer those and walk you through the presentation that he told me about at that 70-year reunion. So Dr. Neil Frank, thank you for gracing us with your presence, your incredible background, and your insight on what's happening and what we might want to be paying attention to. Dr. Neil Frank.
I'm going to just stand down here if it's okay. 22 great-grandchildren, 23, 24, and 25 are on their way. It's amazing. No, Velma and I got married in 1952, so we've been married, 72 years? And we dated 6 years before that. So we're past 75. And Kathy, what a privilege it is. And John, I haven't seen them since I retired, but I tell you, we had some great times there at Channel 11. I'm not sure our conservative view would be that welcome today. I got a question for you. How much do you think it would cost to change the world to green energy? I've heard numbers up to 92 trillion. And you know, the great tragedy of this is that carbon dioxide that is created by burning fossil fuels is not a factor in the global temperature. Now, you've been told that carbon dioxide is a bad pollutant. Quite the contrary. It's just the opposite. Let me show you how important carbon dioxide is. This professor planted 4 trees where he could control the carbon dioxide levels. Now, on the left-hand side, that's 385 parts per million. 400 is the current, so that would represent the current level of carbon dioxide. Let's double that. And you've heard all these bad things about if we double carbon dioxide, the earth is going to come to an end. Well, even from your seat, you can see there's been 100% improvement in the growth of that plant. We may be living in a carbon dioxide-starved atmosphere. If it ever goes below 180, all plants die. I've asked the alarmist a number of times. I said, well, what do you think is the optimum level for carbon dioxide? They don't know. But I'll tell you somebody that does know, the people that operate a nursery. Do you know they bumped the carbon dioxide levels up to 1,200? To 1,200. And even in a nuclear submarine, the levels can go up to 5,000 and no problem at all. Now, the alarmists have zeroed in on 5 meteorological events. And they tell us that because of the increase in carbon dioxide, that all 5 of these things are increasing in intensity and also increasing in terms of violence. Let's start out with the droughts. This graph shows the drought since 1926 on the left-hand side. That peak, that was the Dust Bowl years. And you can see that we've seen a reduction in the number and the intensity of droughts ever since then. Let me tell you, anything that we've seen recently doesn't compare with what happened during the Dust Bowls. I was a preteen in Northwest Kansas during the Dust Bowl, and I can still remember wearing my goggles or taking my goggles because you had to protect the eyes. So droughts haven't increased. Well, it's got to be the damage from forest fires. And of course, the big story is Los Angeles, and it was global warming that caused that. Well, this graph shows the acreage burned by wildfires since 1926. Over on the left-hand side, this is prior to and even World War II. It was bad. Then we had a breakthrough in 1950 when they started using controlled burns. In 1980, the environmentalists came in and said, nah, no more controlled burns because of the animals. And there has been an increase of wildfires since that. But if you take a look at the charts they show you, they always start at 1980. They don't show you the early part of those charts. And let me say something about the Los Angeles fires. It wasn't caused by global warming. Matter of fact, I think the environmentalists were partially, if not totally, responsible for that. They wouldn't allow you to clear your area and clear on no controlled burning, and they controlled the water. So that was partly due to the environmentalists. Oh, how about the sea level? And by the year 2100, New York City will be underwater. This shows the increase in sea level since 1855. It has been very steady. And the rate of increase is 8 inches per century. 8 inches per century. I don't think 8 inches is going to flood New York City. Oh, it's got to be the heat. We've never seen the earth this hot. Look at this story in BBC. July the 24th was the hottest month ever measured I emphasize measured, on Earth, and may be the warmest month in the last 125,000 years. Call your attention to measured. That means it's measured by a thermometer. Well, that record only goes back to 1880. And what was the temperature in 1880? This is the number of weather stations that existed in 1885. There were 15 in the entire southern hemisphere. So even our temperature record is somewhat in doubt. And yes, the temperature has been increasing over the last 175 years. Now, at the top is a graph of the temperature for the last 10,000 years. Way on the right, you can see there's been an increase, right? As we emerged from the Little Ice Age, a very nasty period of weather on the globe. And I'm delighted that we have seen the Earth warm over the last 175 years. I don't want to go back to winters like Washington had in Valley Forge, or in Europe, the Thames River so solid that they have carnivals on it. But the bad news is 1 million people died because of crop failures. Yes, the temperature has increased over the last 175 years. But if you look carefully at the temperature over the last 10,000 years, every 1,000 years there's a peak in the temperature. That's where we are right now. We're at one of those peaks. 1,000 years ago, the temperature was warmer than today. 2,000 years ago, that was the time of Rome. 3,000 years ago, that was the time of Egypt. The peaks at 4, 5, and 6 are not as dramatic, but look at 7 and 8. The temperature has actually dropped 2 to 3 degrees centigrade over the last 10,000 years. Not only was July the warmest temperature in the last 125,000 years, it wasn't even the warmest temperature in the last 10,000 years. So what does the data show? Well, how about an increase in storms? Tornadoes, violent tornadoes, winds of 160 miles an hour. This shows the number of violent tornadoes since 1950. There has been a significant decrease. Matter of fact, way over on the right, 2018, there was no violent storms at all. So tornadoes haven't increased. Well, what about hurricanes? Hurricane-type storms form around the entire world. In the Pacific, they're called typhoons, and in Australia, they're called cyclones. And every time we see a hurricane form, inevitably somebody says, that's got to be global warming. This graph shows the number of worldwide hurricanes since 1980. There's been no increase at all. As a matter of fact, way on the right, in 2021, there were only 37. That's the lowest number since we started keeping record. So the big question, what does the data show? The data shows that there is no climate emergency. Climate change, global warming, no, there's no emergency. So what is driving the information that would suggest that we have global warming? It's an international pressure. If we'd have paid attention to the opening statement of a meeting, the first meeting, incidentally, on carbon dioxide in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, we would know what is driving global warming today. Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilization collapse? And isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Doesn't say a thing about carbon dioxide. And when I first saw that, I said, this doesn't make sense. The conference was supposed to be on carbon dioxide. But a few years later, one of the senior United Nations officials clarified the issue. We redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that the international climate policy is an environmental policy. So what is climate change? What is driving it? This is the answer. It's an international redistribution of wealth. Whose wealth? Yeah, our wealth, which would lead to a one world government. Now, what does that mean for America? Well, there are two ways that we could destroy our economy. Number one, if we complied with the agreements we made in the Paris meeting in 2015, when 196 countries met to determine how to turn the world over to green energy. They divided the 196 into two categories. 150 were developed nations, including India and China. And then there were 46 that were developed countries. Now, they determined at this conference that the developing countries need financial help. So they set up a green climate fund. And the proposal was that fund would have $100 billion per year. Now, this group meets every year. They met in last November. I don't remember where they met, but they met someplace in last November. They determined that $100 billion wasn't enough. They need $1 trillion. Well, they agreed that $300 billion per year would be established, and that money would be distributed to the developing nations. If we complied with the agreement that we have in the Paris Accord, it would cost this nation billions and billions of dollars, because we would be the lead nation in developing the $300 billion. Well, that's one way that we could lose a lot of money. But the other way, and even more effective, convert to green energy. I don't know what that would cost, but it would be trillions of dollars. Now, let me introduce you to another group that is very interested in green energy. That would be the communists. The communists have been around in this nation for over 100 years. As a matter of fact, goes all the way back to 1919. But they determined early on that they would never be able to convert this nation to communism as long as we had a good, solid economy. So when they found out that the main goal of climate change was to destroy our economy, they got on board quickly and began to accelerate their program to try to convert this nation to communism. Let me give you a brief history of communism as it established in this country. In 1917, the communists took over Russia, and then Russia expanded their vision and said, well, let's take over the world. So in 1919, they established communist parties in 35 countries, converting the world to communism. Another important event took place in 1932 in Germany. A group of hardcore Marxists there established a school for Marxism called the Frankfurt School. And under the threat of World War II, they took that school to the United States and located it on the campus of Columbia University. Now, the original concept of Marxism is that the working class, the oppressed class, would one day rise up and through violence overthrow these evil oppressors. Enter the scene, Gramsci. He was Italian. He was a Marxist intellect. And he said, no. You'll never have enough resources to defeat the United States military. And if you want to convert the United States to communism, you have to use a stealth operation. You have to invade all of the major components of the United States through the back door and change it from within. This was certainly consistent with a Chinese philosopher who said the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Now enter the scene the most senior of the Russian soldiers to defect to the United States. He was a colonel, and he wrote a book called Through the Eyes of the Enemy, and he stressed psychological war. He said, Russia spends huge amounts of money developing tools that can be used for psychological warfare that will change a country without fighting. The tools for that warfare would be propaganda, disinformation, deceit, and violence. They also pointed out that Russia has a 4-step program to convert a country to Marxism. Destroy the cultural foundation and the moral base of the country. They allow 25 to 50 years for that to take place. And the main target would be the youth. Now, once they've demoralized a nation, then there's a 5 to 10 year period of conflict, division, confusion, chaos, and all kinds of violence. Hopefully, this will lead to a crisis where the needs of the people cannot be satisfied. Therefore, you can introduce a solution. We, the government, will come in and provide all your needs, a Marxist type of government. Now, the main indoctrination is for the children. Every nation that is converted to communism has done it through the children. Hitler had the brown shirts, Mao had the red guard. It's interesting that Ted Cruz wrote a book about this whole dilemma, and he said that his father was 15 years old when Castro came to power, and it was the young people that caused that to happen. They also had a meeting in the latter part of the last century. I'm not sure exactly when it was, inspired by Russia, with Marxist experts in this nation. And the idea was to develop a program to convert the United States to Marxism. And they ended up citing 10 areas where they needed to do work. Number 1, we need to destroy Christianity. Number 2, we need to destroy the family. Number 3, we need to destroy the moral foundation, particularly sexual. Number 4, promote racism. Number 5, cultivate a left-wing media. Now, as I read down through this list, pay very close attention to what's happening in our society. Create an unreliable legal system. Undermine the institutional authority. Promote mass migration. This was before open borders. Expand your public welfare program, and finally, promote excess drinking. Now, this was done back last century when drinking was the problem. Today, you could say promote drug use. All right, let's take a look at what's happening in these 10 areas. Before doing that, the most important thing that's happened to convert a nation is to indoctrinate the children. So how are we doing on that? Well, there is a top level from the university down, and there's a bottom level from the K through 12 up. Let's start with the top level. Yeonmi Parks was born and raised in North Korea. At the age of 10, and her sister was 12, her parents were arrested for some trivial thing. They had no support. They ate bugs for 2 years to survive. At 13, she ran into somebody who says, I can get you to China where you'll be safe. Little did she know this was a recruiter for the sex trade. She got to China, and they sold her to a farmer. She ran into a missionary, and through a very treacherous track, she got into South Korea. And eventually, fast forward, has a full ride at Columbia University. She was so excited when she went to her first class, and she couldn't believe that what she was hearing. The professor badmouthed America in everything that he said and pointed out what a beautiful system Marxism was. And she went up afterwards and said, sir, I've lived in 2 Marxist societies, and it's not like anything that you have described. He totally ignored her. Every professor she had at Columbia, and even more, were Marxist professors. And this Marxist concept has spread on through the Ivy League. The Fox News has an affiliate called Not Fox Nation, and they produce 20-minute educational videos. One of the videos is how this whole thing has spread into the other Ivy League schools. And from there, it has spread on Westford, University of Chicago, and all the way to the California coast. Now, let me show you another way where Marxism has infiltrated our college system. Let's go back to the disillusioned Vietnam War protesters. One of those is Bill Ayers and his current wife today. They were there when Weather Underground was formed, and they got involved in the bombing of several buildings. They got arrested. But because of some legal errors, they didn't have to go to prison. And after they got out, they said, no, 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 no. Violence is not the way to go. We've got to go a different way. They went back to college and got their Ph.D s so that they could teach in a college. And now they are teaching in the Department of Education at the University of Chicago. Teaching the teachers who are now filtering down and teaching our young children. It's amazing how our colleges have been converted to a Marxist kind of philosophy. Now, there is also a bottom-up. Let's start with a program called 1619, supported by the New York Times. And it's a rewrite of American history. It said American history really started in 1619 when some European capitalism landed on the shores of Virginia with a boatload of slaves. And it was slaves that built this country. And furthermore, they rewrite the history. They destroy the past history of our nation. They demonize all of our heroes. And they leave the children with the impression the problem in America today is the white male. And how about TikTok? Oh, I need to give you a little history on TikTok. Blood Money, Peter Schweitzer, if you are familiar with that name, has a whole chapter on TikTok. Now, let's go back to China. When Mao died in 1976, the current leaders have determined that they're going to make China the number one nation militarily, the number one nation economically, the number one nation politically. And Tim Cotton, Senator Tim Cotton from Arkansas, has an excellent book out now. As a matter of fact, it was published last month. 7 things you can't talk to about China. And one of the things that the Chinese have done is they adopted the same pattern that Russia adopted, where they are going to demonize or to indoctrinate our youth. As a matter of fact, they are doing more than what the Russians did. And the masterpiece of their indoctrination of the youth is TikTok. It's an amazing program. It's like a magnet. It draws everybody in. 170 million U.S. citizens watch TikTok, an average of an hour and a half every day. Unreal. But the real purpose of TikTok is to indoctrinate our children. It is China's Trojan horse. This is what they are teaching our children. They change the morale and the culture values. They rewrite the nation, and it's pro-Chinese. It's interesting that China is also interested in the movie industry. They have spent huge amount of money buying influencer. You're not going to see a movie that says anything negative about China. It's interesting that Texas has now sued TikTok because they said it's dangerous for the kids and it targets minorities and is addictive. China has a version of TikTok, but they have educational features in their version. All right. If you have a top-down or a bottom-up, this is what our children are being taught. They're being indoctrinated, and a God, and American, and a family, and a traditional morality, and capitalism, pro-socialism, pro-gay, pro-transgender, and pro-environment. So let's take a look at how the progress that they've made in these 10 items. Number 1, the church. Gramsci said, as long as the United States stays strong Christian, you'll never be able to convert it to capitalism. So you have to destroy the influence of the church. And Megan Brashen wrote a book called The Shepherds for Sale. And in that book, she describes how the Marxists train people to go into local congregations and work hard so they'll have a position of influence, and then steer them away from their main goal and introduce such thing as secular humanism. Or how about global warming? Every denomination that I've checked in has a very strong movement towards global warming. Have they been successful? In 1970, there were 90% of our citizens claimed to be Christians. By 2020, it had dropped down to 70%. And currently, for the first time in this nation's history, it is below 50%. It is now 45%. Christian parents, you send your child off to college, and 8 out of 10 return after 1 year and reject God and reject the church. Where is the church's voice in society? Francis Schaeffer wrote a very interesting book called The Evangelical Disaster: Failure of Evangelists to Stand for the Truth. Many of the mainline evangelical churches have become left-wing organizations. Now let's turn to the family. 50% of all of our families have been divorced. 40% of first marriages, last 8 years before there's a divorce. 60% of second marriages divorce. Third marriages, 70%. 30% of our young people are raised in a single family home. In some sections, it's up to 65%. The attack on the family became so intense that we had to pass a law in 1996. It says, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. It took the Supreme Court 2 decades before they overruled that and approved gay marriage. Transgender, I don't know where that came from, but I'm telling you, it has become very, very powerful. How about morality? Oh, incidentally, 65% of divorces are because of pornography. Who destroyed the morality of this thing? Hollywood. And interesting, the Russians knew the value of the movie industry. They established an office in 1934 in Hollywood, and they've had a tremendous impact on Hollywood itself. Matter of fact, the Marxist philosophy prevails among that group. Kenneth Billingsley wrote a book, Hollywood Party, showing exactly what happened in the emphasis in Hollywood on Marxism. The Russians, very interested in the movies. Stalin said he could easily convert the world to communism if he could control the American movie industry. Number one, racism. One of the things that communists do is look for conflict, and then they jump right in and enhance that. Let me give you one example. You remember during the Clinton administration, the whole story about burning black churches? Even Clinton says, oh yeah, I saw one of those burn. That wasn't true. That was a lie. And when they checked into it, none of that was true. Do you know what the origin of that was? Moscow. And more recently, how about BLM? Let me give you a little history on that. Eric Mann was another one of the co-founders of the Weather Underground. He got arrested, and he spent 2 years in jail. And he got out, just like Bill Ayers, and said, nah, violence is not the way to go. But he said, I can teach others to be violent. So he established a school in 1988, and 2 of his students were Cullors and Garza, co-founders of BLM, that made their appearance during the riots in 2020. How about the media? Well, I don't need to say much there. When Musk bought Twitter, he discovered this insidious relationship between the government, the media, and big tech. Big tech and the government are both under the control of the government. Let me show you one example of that. You remember the Hunter Biden laptop? Yeah. Well, that was well known before the 2020 election. But they went to the media and the big tech, please don't disclose that until after the election. And 17% of the people that voted for Biden in the election said they wouldn't have if they had discovered that that laptop. How about the corrupt legal system? I want to compare the actions in two areas. In J6 in 2020, compare that with what happened after George Floyd died in May of 2020. Now let's go to the J6. I was shocked when I found that 5,000 of the 12,000 FBI agents had been assigned at one time or other to investigate the J6 group. They spent thousands and thousands of hours going over videos, and more important, they looked at the cell phone records, and they could tell from the cell phone who got in there. Well, 1,500 people were arrested. The average, the common sentence was 2 years, and in some cases, the more violent crimes, it went over 20 years. How about the violent crimes? There are people who believe that the violent crimes were created by BLM and then they quickly left. And the emotions of the crowd followed through. Well, now let's compare that. Let's compare that with what happened after George Floyd died. 5 days of riots destroyed a multiple block area of Minneapolis. 1,500 buildings were burned. The cost to Minneapolis was $500 million. Some weeks later, they finally arrested 600 people. Over 500 they let go because it was trespassing. The only ones that they arrested and put in jail were the ones where they had cell phone records that they stole something. And the average jail time was 2 years. There were a few people that were involved in the more violent that got charges of 5 years. After that, there were 550 riots for the rest of the year, $2 billion worth of damage, 25 people died. As I looked through the records, I could find nothing that would suggest that the FBI came in and got cell phone records and make sure they got everybody that was involved. And then you come to the corrupt institutional authority. Really, this is the police and the military. Pete Hegseth, who is now the Secretary of Defense, was in the Army for 14 years. And then he decided to get out when the controversy came of putting women on the front line during a military operation. And he eventually wrote a book called War on the Warriors. And he explained in there how DEI completely dominated the Pentagon. Well, not only that, it dominated all of the federal government. Did you see recently where the federal government had 460 DEI initiates or programs that cost the taxpayer $1 trillion? $1 trillion. I was stunned when I learned that the top level in the Air Force, a general, said our recruiting goal is 40% white male, 60% DEI. Or how about the Secret Service? The goal there is to have 30% of the Secret Service be women by the year 2000. And all of you can remember this picture of a 5'4" woman escorting Trump away from the assassination attempt, a sure target for a sharpshooter if he hadn't have been shot. Now let's go to mass integration. This is a classic, open borders is a classic communist system. Under the banner of Clurd and Piven. I don't know whether any of you have heard of him or not. This is a husband and wife team. They are hardcore communists and professors at Columbia University, famous for their their community organization. What they would do is go into community and organize it and develop a program that overwhelmed the government. Now, open borders is a classic Clurd Piven on an international scale. I believe the purpose there was to eventually overwhelm our government. As a matter of fact, that leads us to the next thing, expand our public welfare program. That's right. As we go to the illegal aliens and provide for them hotels, inexpensive hotels, we give them cell phones, we give them money, we provide them medical services. We are taxing our government to respond to that. Another example of that would be COVID-19. If you want to know what a communist system looks like, that was that on a minor scale, where the government totally controlled everything we did, including forcing you to get vaccinations. And then they come along, oh, we'll provide you money and you'll support. What's the next step? A communist. Now I want to go with the last step. This is number 10 on our group. Promote drug use. Again, Peter Schweitzer in his book called Blood Money has a whole chapter on fentanyl. The ingredients, the chemicals that required are made in China, but they have a law over there that you can't turn them into pills. They don't want their own people to be drug addicts. They send these chemicals by boat, Chinese boat, all the way across to the west coast of Mexico, where they anchor at a Chinese port, and then they're taken into a Chinese laboratory where they are converted to pills on machines that were generated in China itself. And then they bring those pills on into the United States, and 100,000, at least that's a good estimate, 100,000 die each year. That was the list of 10 items they've done. It's remarkable the progress they had, which brings me right back to climate change. The whole key to this is to destroy our economy. And that's what it's all about. We're being asked to spend send billions of dollars to third world nations and have no idea what they'll expend it on. Now, past experience would tell us that the leaders in those countries are going to become very wealthy with that money. Which brings me to the point and where I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that everybody that promotes global warming is a communist. As a matter of fact, the number one reason for it is the international exchange of money. Number two, money is a big issue in terms of the nation. Al Gore was worth $2 million when he left his vice presidency. He invested in 14 green energy companies, subsidized by the federal government by $2.5 billion, and he's a multimillionaire today. Global warming is a big industry in the United States. I cannot tell you how many professors, salary or paid, out of global warming. Texas A&M has a very good Department of Meteorology. Every one of those professors, I think, is being paid by global money. Then there's the true believers. Oh, yeah, the ones that develop the numerical models, they believe their models. And the models all predict that there's going to be big warming. That's because they've got the wrong relation in the models about carbon dioxide and global warming. And then finally, you have the Marxists that are laid on and say, aha, we support that because the primary purpose is to destroy our economy. Which brings me to my last point. I believe that the communists feel that they no longer have to be in the dark. I believe that they won the war. They no longer have a stealth operation. They can be up and fronted in what they're going to do. And I believe that Obama was the first move in that direction. Now, what do we know about Obama? In the preteen, he was in Indonesia in a Muslim school. He went back to Hawaii as a teenager, where he was raised by his grandparents and ran into a very hard communist by the name of Frank Davis. Frank Davis became his absent father. Then he went to Occidental College, where he was very active in the Student Communist Party, advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government by force. Then he went to Columbia University and came underneath the teaching of Floyd and Previn and learned community organization. Then he went to Harvard, and the most Marxist professor at Harvard said he's the best student he ever had. He came back to Chicago and tinkered around in community organization and finally ended up in the White House and surrounded himself by 15 czars that were either communist or communist-leaning, including Valerie Jarrett, who was probably his most influential person, and she came right out of a communist background. To my knowledge, he has never renounced his ties to communism. You know, if he applied for a top-secret clearance, he'd be rejected. And I think the plan was for Hillary to be our first socialist president. Surprise, surprise, she didn't make it. So plan B was destroy Trump while he's in office through lawsuits and all kinds of Steele dossier. You remember that was sponsored by the Democrats, if I remember right. And they had to find somebody that could run against him so that he would be defeated. And they had several requirements. Number one, that he has face recognition. Well, certainly Biden fit that goal. Had to have a big ego and didn't mind stretching the truth once in a while. Well, Biden would fit that role. And he had to be somebody that they control. They knew that he was in the early stages of dementia from the very beginning. And because of that, they said, no. We're not going to put you out on the campaign trail. And so he won. And then he had 4 years. The best description of what's happened in the last 4 years was made by Drago, who was born and raised in Poland. He was 24, I guess it was, in 1984. He was arrested and spent 2 years in jail. He got out and came back to the United States, became a citizen, and served 20 years on the Navy SEAL. This is the way he describes the last 4 years. Never in the history of civilization has a nation declined more economically, politically, socially, militarily, morally, and globally over such a brief period of time as the United States. However, the collapse is unique because it was done intensely from within and with little opposition. Now, in a military operation, perhaps the most important people you have are the scouts. They go behind the line and tell you what the enemy's doing. Let me tell you, there are a bunch of scouts out there today. I've listed 13 books that have been published just in the last 2 years. I could add another 15 to those that have been published before that. They're all scouts. And what are they saying? Wake up, America. Let me tell you, one person who's awake, and that's the president. And the future of this nation will depend on whether we support him. I believe that God's hand is on him. The very fact that he survived an assassination. Will we support him and get behind him? That's the key. Appreciate the opportunity sharing with you.
Yeah, we're going to have Q&A. I went around and put y'all out some little cards if you have questions for him, because you might have some questions. Listen, I don't think you can take a hard question. I was going to say, there is no question you can.
And I'm the one with the mic.
Yep.
So if you have a question, I will rush as soon as I get there. First hand I saw was over here.
Back in the early 70s, when I was at University of Texas in Plan 2, in molecular and cellular biology, our professor said that carbon is necessary for life. Without carbon, you cannot have life. So I do not understand why all the meteorologists say that there's a consensus. And science is never based on consensus. Science should always be questioned. Why do you think the meteorologists have gone along with this?
Well, one, they've been pressured to do that. The top of the Weather Service is NOAA, and NOAA very much supported global warming. And so they forced everybody underneath them to do that. But let me tell you, and Kathy, I think would realize, very few of the meteorologists that you see on the air have ever gone back and looked at the details. They don't know. And so they are only parroting what these experts from MIT tell them.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I knew when I was younger, like in the 80s, about like one year I found about El Nino. And then suddenly after El Nino came, when this weird snowstorm happened in California. I'm from California. Then there was La Nina. And I was a little confused why there would be an El Nino and then a La Nina. And then suddenly, like when I came to Texas and I've traveled all over, I've seen planes spraying things into our atmosphere. And I've read about the things. They say it's aluminum and very heavy metals.
Yeah.
And it's in our ground and soil. What is your opinion?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that El Nino and La Nina are two different meteorological events. And they last 5 to 7 years, and then you'll go from La Nina to El Nino. So this is a meteorological event that has a long time. Now, you're asking about chemtrails. I don't have a strong opinion on that. I know that it exists on a small scale. If you were going to change the temperature of the entire globe, you would have to put out a lot of stuff. Airlines would have to have these generators on them so that you would. I don't think that we can do that on that scale. Does the things that they are discharging, will that affect life? I don't know. Oftentimes we do things and then find out later on that that wasn't good. So yes, they are experimenting with chemtrails. Trying to stop the global warming. That's their, and I don't want to go back to an ice age. I don't want to go back to a little ice age. But the idea is that you reflect the sunlight and therefore it'll cool the earth.
Thank you, Dr. Frank, for sharing your information. Question for you is, when was temperature and weather started to be charted? People always refer to the changing it, but I thought I heard that it's been a very, the tracking of weather and temperature changes is pretty new.
Well, it's new in the sense of tracking it with a thermometer. That only goes back to like 1880. But the records for the temperature for the last 10,000 years are made from ice core samples. And they got all kinds of other ways that you can determine what the temperature was before the thermometers.
We next?
And weather, I want to add, weather we tend to think that what we're observing today is the normal weather. No. Weather is up and down and changing in a long-term time scale. So just because we're at this point doesn't mean this is what the weather has been for centuries.
Weather question, mundane weather question. We keep seeing things about the polar vortexes are going to give us another derecho sometime next week. And as the former head of the National Hurricane Center, I'm very interested in your opinion of what the hurricane outlook is for the Gulf Coast for the year 2025. Thank you.
I don't have an opinion on that. A good friend of mine, Dr. Bill Gray, of course, he's dead today, but he started a program where he could forecast what kind of season it would be. The season is the total number of storms, but specifically trying to say whether one will hit Texas or not, don't have any skill.
Is there any way? Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any way for us to get the recording of your presentation?
Yeah, I apologize. Every once in a while, I had a senior moment in that. But at 93, that's okay.
Woohoo!
And my wife is 6 months older than me.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh, okay. I was just going to ask a question about. We hear a lot about this now. We don't know how much the weather is going to be affected by this. People are trying to scare us with the EMP thing and all that kind of stuff. How will that affect our weather? I mean, if we do have a total electric grid turnout.
I didn't get all that question now.
The EMP, what do they call? Anyway,
Oh, yeah, I don't know. That's all kind of a new area.
But
I have no idea what that's going to, whether they can do anything. See, puny man has this inflated view of what we can do. I remember when I was at the Hurricane Center, people said, well, all you have to do is go out and do the atomic bomb and it'll blow that thing apart. The amount of energy that is consumed in a few seconds of time in a hurricane is bigger than the biggest bomb that man has ever made. I mean, energy on the national, on an international is huge. And by that, I mean, you can measure the wind and that represents energy.
I have a question from an anonymous person. Do you believe, with your background, that a hurricane can be steered to hit a specific or general area?
No. I was there when we did experiments on hurricanes back in 1969. We went out, and the whole concept was that we could go out and seed some of these outer bands, and as they would grow, the inner bands would die, and the hurricane would flex its arm like an ice skater. Okay, spread your arms out, you spin a little bit slower. Well, the first thing that you have is a problem. How are you going to monitor this storm with enough frequency to know whether you have any effect or not? I mean, you have a limited number of aircraft with instrumentation that can even go out. And the other thing is you mess around with something like that, and then a hurricane, whether you did anything or not, goes into Mexico, then you can have all kinds of lawsuits. So they abandoned the whole thing. And there's no way. No. To steer hurricanes, you've got to affect weather on a huge, huge scale.
I have one.
I just wanted to ask, there's people that say that there's going to be a polar shift.
Right.
Where the magnetic north changes. Do you have any comments about that?
No, I don't. I don't know what effect that has. Again, I emphasize that this whole polar vortex, it comes and goes and comes and goes. It's only been around since the Earth was formed. I don't know. So, but the media gets so tied up. It's like global warming. Every time there is a storm, whether it be a blizzard or whether it be a hurricane, that's because of global warming. Yeah, and then the reason they changed the name, because there wasn't any global warming, so they called it climate change. Now, you haven't heard this latest thing, is climate extreme. So when you have an extreme winter blizzard, it's climate extreme.
Does anyone who has not asked a question have a question? Do you believe that there is such a thing as artificially created weather?
Only on a very, very small scale. A good friend of mine, Dr. Joanne Simpson, incidentally, got the first Ph.D. On a woman in the history of the University of Chicago. She experimented with an individual thunderstorm or individual cloud. And maybe if the cloud is in the right shape, it has to be just barely above the freezing level. You can go out and maybe encourage this cloud to grow a little bit. But on a big scale, no.
We're going to get another question from Maria. She took notes today, and they are really good notes. So let's see what she has to ask.
Another just quick question, which I've always wondered. Growing up, it seemed like the weathermen would give like a 3-day report, and even that was not accurate. It would change. Now we get a 10-day or a 2-week report. How are they able to predict so far ahead?
I was one that only gave a 3-day report because I knew that beyond that, it wasn't very good. But let me tell you, the numerical models have become very, very good in forecasting trends. Specifically, they're not going to forecast 20 inches of rain at your house, but they are good at the trends. And the visual presentation of data now, Kathy, is just unbelievable. Unbelievable. You know, I don't know whether you remember or not, but I was one of the first person that actually drew the forecast map in my forecast. Well, now then, it is all generated by a computer, and you see the cloud, you see the rain. It's amazing. So the current models, I think, are very good at indicating trends up to, say, 5 to 10 days. And beyond that,
I will say that in that office, there were hanging charts. I will say that there are hanging charts in that office that were constantly maintained as to what's most current so that you could lift and go back and see. So what I can say is what you already know, the real deal.
we paid very close attention to the data because that's all we had. And today, many of the people that give a presentation on the air have very limited background and experience. And if the model doesn't, if the computer fails in the model, they don't know what to do. Yeah.
Dr. Frank, I listened to a talk by Phil Archer who said that Ray Miller never allowed the advertising department in the newsroom. And he feels like since that's changed, the news has changed and we're not getting the truth. But also our oldest son, who is an A&M graduate and a retired colonel in the Air Force, who directed weather operations, his specialty was meteorology, and he directed the weather operations in the Gulf Wars, said that, yes, the Air Force can control the weather.
I would disagree with that. On a small scale, yes. Now, I have seen reports of maybe there was a fog bank and they could go in and drop something in it over a runway and the weather would clear it enough that an airplane could land. But they are not changing the weather on a big scale. Absolutely not.
I have a question, Dr. Frank. We are obviously people of an age.
No,
And
you're all younger.
well, but we have, most of us have lived through exactly what you talked about.
Absolutely.
We have seen what is happening to
Right.
America. And quite frankly, I think that we have not done what we should have done. We have lived in with a blanket over our head
Right.
or whatever, okay? So my question is, we understand,
Right.
we agree. What can we be doing? What are the things that we can do
Right.
to make a difference in America today, other than the obvious, which has been obviously to elect Donald Trump, looking forward for the next 10 years?
That is a very difficult question, and that's a question that I ask myself over and over. I've read all of these books that I showed here. I've read all those books. I'm stuffed full of knowledge. But what good does that do if I can't get this out some way to influence people? And and see, one of the great tragedies in modern life is that we're so programmed. Let me describe a typical experience. Go to work, come home, turn the TV on while we're while we're eating supper or dinner, and then go in and get on a couch and watch TV and fall asleep, go back into bed and repeat the cycle tomorrow. Can't wait for the weekend for the Texans to play. So our whole world is centered around athletics as a, you know what, one of the reasons Rome disappeared because they became overconsumed with athletics, and they became observers rather than participants of that activity. I don't have the answer to you that, but one of the things that I do know is that once we find a representative that will share our view, then we vote for them. Absolutely vote for them. And hold there, yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that us cutting down all these trees and putting in all the concrete has had effect on the weather?
Do I believe what?
That the cutting down of trees has affected weather.
No, again, we're talking about a small scale cutting down of the trees across the entire world. We tend to think, well, we cut this forest down. That's so little. And so, no, I don't think it has affected a major part in the world.
Do I hear someone with a question?
By any chance, have you published this that we can buy the book?
No.
You can only get the PowerPoint. Huh?
If you gave me the choice of digging a ditch or writing a book, I'd dig the ditch. I wished that, my wife is so good. I wished somehow that I was going to become a basketball coach. Okay. So I didn't work that hard in school. Velma has had to correct everything I've ever written, including my Ph.D. dissertation. And she can't tell you how many times Velma, how do you pronounce or how do you spell this word? She has been a real sweetheart down through the years, and she has talent. I have an older daughter that is just flows. And maybe you flow too with your writing. I don't know. And Kathy, did you write a lot or not? Yeah. So, I'll give talks. I don't mind putting together a presentation, and I'd go give a presentation every day if I had an opportunity. But since I left Channel 11, and that was in 2008, not many opportunities. As a matter of fact, I've been most surprised that we live in an oil industry, why I'm not getting more requests from that industry to go and share what
they have no idea that you are capable.
Yeah.
Because of age.
Yeah.
Come on, is this not true? We are not being taken advantage of because of what we've lived, what we've learned, right. And we are not active. This is the truth, guys. This
That's right.
Our activeness is coming to this meeting, but most of us already knew most of what he said. Is this not true?
That's right.
Okay. Shame on us. It's time for us to figure out that we have got to make a difference, one by one, of telling people what we know, what we've experienced, and sharing this information, okay? And it may be only people our age who will be able to grasp it, but maybe we can talk to our sons and daughters and grandchildren and tell them the truth. But we're going to have to be proactive and intentional. We cannot wait for them to come and ask us. We can't be afraid of not sharing what we know. Am I right?
That's right. Absolutely. That's right. That's right. That's right. It's interesting. There are some very, very powerful people that challenge global warming. But those professors are generally retired. There is several groups of very, very talented people yeah. Well, but the problem is, and I'm speaking, you can't get their opinion on the media because the media is so tied up by what has been the government on global warming. Yeah, well, I don't know. Let me tell you, I was so encouraged when I saw that NOAA is going to, right now, the proposal is to fire 2,000 people. And I'm wondering if that will not come in the global warming group. See, I think that's where a lot of it'll come from.
Okay, I have a question. Many of us have read some of the geoengineering material that's out and about the HARP system. And do you know anything about the HARP system? Is that true or not? Because there's a lot of geoengineering information from that. Okay, well, how do you explain what they're saying about it then? They're just making it up?
The HARP system?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't make a comment on it because I don't identify with that right now.
Okay. I might send you some stuff.
Control the weather.
Yeah.
True. And I think that's what you're asking.
Yes.
No. Again, man operates on a very small scale compared to the scale of the atmosphere.
I have a question, and I don't know. Do you remember about the cow that was in Conroe that the weathermen would always try to tell what the weather was?
No.
And the cow, they would say it's going to rain or it's not going to rain. The cow would go to the barn every time it would rain. And they said the cow was right more than the weathermen.
Right. Well, I can tell you this, that God has given the animal kingdom special skills. And whether it's cow or whether it's some other,
That's
there
like
is a sensitivity to that.
Yeah, that's like the tsunamis.
Yeah.
All the animals leave.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions that anyone has? This has been a phenomenal thing to confirm what we sort of already knew, but we have got to make sure that we don't let it die with us. Dr. Frank?
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
Thank you.
But again, if you're going to get it to the masses, you've got to do it through the media. And the media right now is tied in to the global warming. And these young people that are on the air, they have never gone back and looked at the data and looked at the and tried to interpret their conclusions from the data. If they would, they'll come to the same conclusion that I come to.
So I have a question for you, okay? As we heard tonight, this is being recorded, all right? You can watch it again. How do we get it?
Okay. As soon as it's edited and it is ready, then Norma, head of communications, will be sending it out by email, and we'll also be sending it to other clubs and to other organizations and to perhaps the U.S. Pastors Council. And we'll just think of everybody who could and should get their hands on it. And so, yes? Right. You leave the email, and also you could check with the website too.
Okay, you have been given your assignment, and it's easy. What?
Dr. Neil Frank, YouTube, you will find that. As soon as we can, we'll upload it to YouTube as well. And so that'll go much faster.
No reduction.
Yeah.
I don't have anything on the schedule right now. Except great-grandchildren. And we're programmed there.
Yeah.
I think that's all of the questions that we have. Can we give a round of applause to Dr. Neil Frank? Outstanding.